Story 1. The Night Martha Remembered. It was supposed to be just another night on the job, but sometimes the most ordinary of nights unravel into the kind of horror you never see coming. This is a story about a young woman named Lydia who took on a seemingly simple task, only to find herself stepping into a nightmare that would leave her forever changed. Lydia had been working as a direct care aide for a few years. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and she had grown used to dealing with the various challenges that came with taking care of those who couldn't fully care for themselves. When she was offered a night shift to look after a 65-year-old woman named Martha, she didn't hesitate to accept. The pay was decent, and the job seemed straightforward enough. But Lydia couldn't have known that this one night would be different, terrifyingly different. Martha lived with her daughter, Colleen, in a modest 2-story home on the outskirts of town. Colleen had explained to Lydia that her mother suffered from dementia, and that although Martha was mostly manageable, she had episodes where she became confused and agitated. Lydia had dealt with similar cases before, so she felt confident she could handle it. Colleen left for her night shift at work shortly after introducing Lydia to Martha. The older woman had smiled weakly at Lydia, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Lydia noticed the way Martha's hands trembled slightly as she was led upstairs to her bedroom by her daughter. Colleen assured Lydia that Martha was usually quiet at night, but warned her that if Martha did get up, she might wander the house in a state of confusion. It was around 9:00 p.m. when Lydia settled in for what she expected to be an uneventful night. She sat in the living room, flipping through channels on the television. The house was too quiet, Lydia thought, but she shook off the uneasy feeling that had started to creep up on her. An hour passed without incident, and Lydia began to relax. She decided to grab a snack from the kitchen and was just about to take a bite of her sandwich when she heard a noise from upstairs. It was faint, just the sound of footsteps, but it made her pause. "Martha," Lydia called out, but there was no response. She listened for a moment longer, hearing nothing but the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Shrugging it off, Lydia returned to the living room, sandwich in hand, and tried to focus on the show playing on the screen. But then she heard it again, the soft padding of feet on the floor above her. Lydia set her plate down and stood up, her pulse quickening. She moved to the bottom of the staircase, peering up into the darkness. "Martha," she called again, louder this time. Still there was no answer. She could hear the faint creak of a floorboard, followed by the sound of a door closing softly. Lydia's heart skipped a beat. Something didn't feel right. She hesitated for a moment before deciding to check on Martha. As she climbed the stairs, the house seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing closer, the shadows lengthening. She reached the top of the stairs and saw that Martha's bedroom door was ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through. "Martha," Lydia said as she gently pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, and there was no sign of the elderly woman. Lydia felt a chill run down her spine. She checked the bathroom next, but it was empty as well. The house was silent again, save for the sound of her own breathing, which seemed too loud in the stillness. Lydia was about to turn back downstairs when she heard a soft rustling noise coming from the room at the end of the hallway, the spare bedroom Colleen had mentioned. Lydia approached the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The door was slightly open, and as she reached out to push it further, it creaked loudly, echoing down the empty hallway. She peered into the darkness, squinting to make out the shapes inside. And then she saw her Martha, standing in the middle of the room, facing the wall. Lydia let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "Martha," Lydia said softly, stepping into the room. "What are you doing in here?" The old woman didn't respond. She just stood there, motionless, her back to Lydia. The air in the room was heavy, thick with something Lydia couldn't quite name. "Let's get you back to bed," Lydia said, trying to keep her voice calm. She reached out to touch Martha's shoulder, but before her hand could make contact, Martha suddenly turned around. Lydia gasped and took a step back. The look on Martha's face was one of pure, unadulterated terror. Her eyes were wide, filled with a kind of fear that Lydia had never seen before. Her mouth was open as if she were about to scream, but no sound came out. "Martha, it's okay," Lydia said, her voice trembling. "It's just me, Lydia. I'm here to help you." But Martha didn't seem to hear her. She stared at Lydia, unblinking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, without warning, she lunged at Lydia, her hands clawing at the younger woman's face. Lydia screamed and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. She managed to push Martha away, but the older woman kept coming, her eyes wild, her movements erratic. "Martha, stop!" Lydia cried, trying to fend off the frenzied attack. But Martha was stronger than she looked, and her grip was like iron. Desperate, Lydia shoved Martha hard, sending her crashing into the wall. Martha crumpled to the floor, breathing heavily. Lydia stood there, panting, her heart racing. She watched as Martha slowly pushed herself up, her eyes still locked onto Lydia's. And then Martha did something that chilled Lydia to the bone. She started to smile. It wasn't the weak, tired smile Lydia had seen earlier. No, this smile was different. It was twisted, malevolent, and filled with a kind of dark amusement that made Lydia's blood run cold. "What's so funny?" Lydia whispered, backing away toward the door. But Martha didn't answer. She just kept smiling that horrible smile, her eyes glinting in the darkness. Lydia didn't wait to find out what Martha was planning to do next. She bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She ran down the stairs, her heart pounding in her ears. She had to get out of there. She had to get help. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard a loud, metallic clanging noise coming from the kitchen. Lydia froze. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like something was being opened and shut over and over again. She crept toward the kitchen, her footsteps slow and cautious. The clanging grew louder, more insistent, and as she rounded the corner, she saw the source of the noise. Martha was standing in front of the oven, repeatedly opening and slamming the oven door shut. The sound reverberated through the house, each slam making Lydia flinch. Martha didn't seem to notice Lydia standing there, her focus entirely on the oven. "Martha, what are you doing?" Lydia asked, her voice shaking. She didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted to run out the door and never look back, but another part of her knew she couldn't just leave Martha like this. Slowly, she approached the old woman, her heart hammering in her chest. As she got closer, she noticed something in Martha's hand, something shiny and metallic. It was a knife, a large kitchen knife, and Martha was holding it tightly, her knuckles white. "Martha, put the knife down," Lydia said, trying to keep her voice calm. But Martha didn't respond. She just kept slamming the oven door, her movements growing more frantic. "Martha, please," Lydia begged. "You're scaring me." Finally, Martha stopped. She turned to look at Lydia, her expression blank. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, without a word, Martha dropped the knife to the floor with a loud clang. The sound seemed to break the spell, and Martha's shoulders slumped as if all the fight had drained out of her. Lydia quickly grabbed the knife and set it on the counter, well out of Martha's reach. She gently guided the older woman back upstairs, back to her room, where she helped her into bed. Martha didn't resist. She just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, her eyes dull and empty. "Good night, Martha," Lydia said softly, pulling the covers up to Martha's chin. But Martha didn't respond. She just kept staring, unblinking, as Lydia backed out of the room and closed the door. Lydia returned to the spare room, her hands shaking. She couldn't stop thinking about the look on Martha's face, that twisted smile, the way she had lunged at her. Lydia knew she wouldn't be able to sleep, but she lay down anyway, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she could get through the rest of the night without any more incidents. But as the hours dragged on, sleep eventually claimed her. Lydia didn't know how long she had been asleep when she suddenly woke up, her heart racing. Something had disturbed her, something that set her nerves on edge. She looked around the room, her eyes straining to see in the darkness. And then she saw at the closet door, which had been closed, was now slightly open. A sliver of blackness peered out at her, and Lydia's breath caught in her throat. She heard a faint rustling sound, like someone shifting their weight. Lydia's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Was it Martha? Had she gotten up again? "Hello," Lydia whispered, her voice trembling. There was no response. Slowly, she sat up, her eyes fixed on the closet door. She could see the outline of something new, someone standing just inside the closet, hidden in the shadows. "Martha," Lydia said, her voice barely audible. But it wasn't Martha. Lydia could see that now. The figure in the closet was too tall, too broad-shouldered to be the frail old woman. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the figure, trying to will herself to move, to do something, anything, but she was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. Then the figure in the closet stepped forward, and Lydia's world shattered. It wasn't Martha. It wasn't anyone she recognized. It was something else, something dark and malevolent. Its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, the figure stepped closer, and Lydia could see its twisted, inhuman features, the way its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, its sharp teeth gleaming in the faint light from the hallway. Lydia wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. The figure moved closer, its breath hot and rancid against her face. "Who are you?" Lydia whispered, her voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. It just kept grinning. Its eyes locked onto hers. Lydia knew she had to do something, had to get out of there, but she couldn't move. She was trapped, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body refusing to obey. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The room was empty, the closet door still slightly open, but the figure had vanished. Lydia sat there, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know what had just happened, didn't know if it had been real or just a nightmare. But one thing was certain, she was never coming back to this house again. The next morning, Colleen returned to find Lydia sitting in the living room, pale and trembling. Lydia didn't tell her what had happened, didn't mention the figure in the closet. She just handed Colleen her keys and left without a word. Lydia never spoke of that night again, but the memory of it haunted her for the rest of her life. She knew that what she had seen wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was something real, something dark and terrible that had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike, and Lydia knew that whatever it was still out there, waiting. Story 2: The House on Craven Road. Working for a small plumbing company wasn't exactly the dream job, but for Rick, it was a means to an end. He had bills to pay, and the work was steady, if not glamorous. Most days, his job involved unclogging drains, fixing leaky pipes, and dealing with the occasional angry customer who couldn't understand why plumbing couldn't be fixed in an instant. But there was one job, a single, solitary call that Rick would never forget. A job that began like any other, and ended with him questioning everything he thought he knew about the world. It was a dreary autumn day when Rick received the call. The weather matched his mood, overcast and gloomy, with a chill in the air that seemed to seep into his bones. Rick was hoping for an easy day, maybe a couple of quick jobs that would allow him to finish early and enjoy a quiet evening at home. But as fate would have it, the call he received was anything but ordinary. Rick's boss, Dave, was a no-nonsense kind of guy. He ran his plumbing company with a tight fist, assigning jobs without much thought to who got what. So when Rick was given a call to check out a leaky pipe in a house on Craven Road, a place he'd never heard of before, he didn't think much of it. The address was in a part of town that was unfamiliar to him, but that wasn't unusual. The city was large, and there were always new neighborhoods popping up, old ones falling into disrepair. Rick punched the address into his GPS and set off. As he drove, the city gradually gave way to more rural surroundings. The houses grew farther apart, the streets narrower and more winding. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their branches hanging low, as if trying to block out the sunlight that struggled to break through the thick clouds above. Craven Road appeared almost out of nowhere, a narrow, unpaved street that looked more like a forgotten path than an actual road. Rick slowed down as his GPS guided him to the end of the street, where the house stood, waiting. The first thing Rick noticed about the house was its condition. It looked as though it had been abandoned for years. The paint was peeling, the windows were cracked, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. The air around the house felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was thick with something unspoken, something wrong. Rick parked his van and sat for a moment, staring at the house. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about the place unsettled him. It wasn't just the dilapidated state of the house, it was the feeling that he was being watched, that the house itself was aware of him. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, Rick grabbed his toolbox and stepped out of the van. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let some creepy old house get in the way. The sooner he fixed the leak, the sooner he could get out of there. The door to the house was slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. Rick hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The door creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Rick stepped inside, his boots crunching on the dusty floor. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. There was no response. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that presses down on your eardrums and makes your skin crawl. Rick looked around, taking in the bare walls, the empty rooms. There was no furniture, no signs of life, nothing to suggest that anyone had lived there in a long time. The house smelled musty, like damp wood and old memories. Rick couldn't help but notice the absence of any personal belongings, no pictures on the walls, no knickknacks or furniture. It was as if the house had been stripped of anything that made it a home. "Hello," Rick called again, louder this time. He was starting to feel more than a little uneasy. Who had called him here? Why was the house so empty? He pulled out his phone and checked the address again. This was the place, no doubt about it. But something wasn't right. He heard footsteps, then soft, shuffling footsteps coming from upstairs. Rick froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't alone after all. "Hello?" he called out once more, his voice shaking slightly. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was upstairs was in no hurry to reveal themselves. Rick considered leaving, getting back in his van, and driving away. But he was a professional, and professionals didn't just abandon a job because things got a little creepy. Swallowing his fear, Rick made his way to the staircase. The steps creaked under his weight as he climbed, each one sounding like a gunshot in the silence. The upstairs was just as empty as the ground floor. There were 3 rooms, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom, all devoid of any signs of life. The only thing that stood out was the door at the end of the hallway. It was closed, unlike the others, and for some reason that made Rick's heart race even faster. He approached the door cautiously, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. The air in the hallway was thick, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make his move. Rick turned the knob and pushed the door open. What he saw inside made his blood run cold. The room was empty, save for a single, solitary chair in the center. On the chair sat an old man, his back to Rick. The man was hunched over, his head hanging low as if he were asleep. His clothes were dirty, tattered, and his hair was long and unkempt. "Sir," Rick said, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't respond. Rick took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Sir, are you okay?" The man's head jerked up suddenly, and Rick gasped. The man's face was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his skull. His eyes were sunken, hollow, and when he looked at Rick, it was as if he were looking through him, into something far beyond. Rick took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to get out, to leave this place, and never look back. But before he could move, the man spoke. "They're coming," the old man whispered, his voice raspy and weak. "They're coming for me." Rick frowned, confused. "Who's coming? What are you talking about?" The old man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned his head to look at the window on the far side of the room. The sky outside had darkened considerably, thick clouds blocking out what little light remained. Rick followed the man's gaze and froze. There was something outside, something moving in the darkness. He squinted, trying to make out the shapes, but it was too dark to see clearly. "Sir, I think we should get out of here," Rick said, his voice shaking. He turned to leave, but the old man grabbed his arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "It's too late," the old man said, his eyes wide with terror. "They're already here." Rick looked back at the window, and his blood turned to ice. The shapes outside were getting closer, moving with a slow, deliberate purpose. Rick's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but nothing made sense. The shapes were human at least. They looked human, but there was something wrong about them, something twisted and unnatural. Rick yanked his arm free from the old man's grasp and bolted for the door. He didn't care what was going on, didn't care about the job. He just needed to get out of that house. He ran down the stairs, his heart pounding in his ears. The house seemed to close in around him, the walls narrowing, the shadows deepening. As he reached the front door, he heard a noise behind him, a low, guttural growl that made his skin crawl. Rick didn't stop to look back. He threw the door open and sprinted to his van. The sky had grown even darker, the air thick with an impending storm. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he tried to unlock the door. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. Rick's heart raced as he finally managed to get the door open. He jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling fingers. He looked back at the house, expecting to see the old man standing in the doorway. But the doorway was empty. The house stood silent, dark, as if it were just another abandoned building, but Rick knew better. He knew there was something inside that house, something evil, something that had been waiting for him. And he knew that if he didn't leave now, he might never get the chance. He turned the key in the ignition, his hands shaking. The van roared to life, and Rick wasted no time pulling out of the driveway. As he drove down Craven Road, the house quickly disappeared from view, swallowed by the thick trees that lined the street. But the sense of unease didn't leave him. In fact, it only grew stronger the farther he got from the house. Rick glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the old man or something worse following him. But the road behind him was empty. He forced himself to focus on the road ahead, determined to put as much distance between himself and that house as possible. But no matter how far he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rick reached the main road. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding and eased off the gas pedal. The worst was behind him, or so he thought. But as he drove, Rick noticed something strange. The road in front of him seemed to stretch on forever, longer than it should have. The trees on either side of the road grew taller, denser, their branches arching over the road like a tunnel. Rick's heart began to race again. He knew this road, it was supposed to lead back to the city, back to civilization. But the farther he drove, the more lost he felt. It was as if the road was leading him somewhere else, somewhere he didn't want to go. Panic set in as Rick realized he couldn't remember how long he had been driving. His GPS was no help. It had lost signal miles ago, and the screen was now just a blank, static-filled display. Rick's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he fought the rising tide of fear. He needed to stay calm, needed to think rationally. But it was hard to do that when the road in front of him seemed to stretch on into infinity with no end in sight. And then he saw a shape in the road ahead. Rick squinted, trying to make out what it was. As he got closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was the house. The same house on Craven Road. Somehow, impossibly, he had driven in a circle and ended up back where he started. Rick's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had been driving in a straight line. There was no way he could have ended up back here. But the house was unmistakable, with its peeling paint and cracked windows. Rick's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had to get out of here, had to find another way back to the city. But as he looked down the road, his heart sank. There was no other road. Craven Road was the only path, and it led straight back to the house. Rick stared at the house, his mind reeling. He had to make a choice: drive back down the road and hope it led somewhere else, or go back to the house and try to figure out what was happening. But before he could make a decision, the door of the house creaked open. Rick's heart pounded in his chest as he watched a figure step out onto the porch. It was the old man. Rick's blood ran cold as he realized the old man was staring straight at him, his hollow eyes locked onto Rick's van. The old man raised a hand and beckoned Rick forward, a slow, deliberate gesture that sent a shiver down Rick's spine. Rick's instincts screamed at him to turn the van around and drive as fast as he could. But something held him back, something that whispered in his mind, telling him that he needed to know the truth. Against his better judgment, Rick put the van in park and stepped out. The air was thick with tension as he slowly made his way up the driveway, his heart pounding in his ears. The old man watched him approach, his expression unreadable. As Rick reached the porch, the old man stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter the house. Rick hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The door closed behind him with a soft click, sealing him inside the house once more. The silence was deafening as Rick stood in the entryway, his heart racing. The old man shuffled past him, leading him to the room at the end of the hall, the same room Rick had found him in before. The chair was still there, empty now, but the room felt different, darker, colder. The old man gestured for Rick to sit, and despite his fear, Rick complied. The old man took a seat across from him, his hollow eyes fixed on Rick. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the ticking of a clock somewhere in the house, each tick echoing like a heartbeat. Finally, the old man spoke. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice low and raspy. Rick swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "I didn't want to," he said. "But I didn't have a choice." The old man nodded as if he understood. The house has a way of drawing people in, he said. Once you enter, it's hard to leave. Rick felt a chill run down his spine. What is this place? He asked, his voice trembling. The old man sighed, his shoulders slumping. This house is cursed, he said. It's been here for longer than anyone can remember, and it's always been the same, empty, abandoned, yet somehow alive. Rick frowned, confused. Alive? What do you mean? The old man looked up, his hollow eyes filled with a deep sadness. This house feeds on fear, he said. It draws people in, traps them, and feeds on their terror. It's been doing it for centuries. Rick's heart pounded in his chest. How do you know this? The old man's gaze grew distant, as if he were lost in a memory. I've been here a long time, he said. Longer than I can remember. I was once like you, young, full of life, with a future ahead of me. But I made the mistake of entering this house, and now I'm trapped. Rick's mind raced, trying to process what he was hearing. Trapped? You mean you can't leave? The old man shook his head. The house won't let me, he said. It won't let anyone who enters leave. Not really. You can try to escape, but no matter how far you go, you'll always end up back here. Rick felt a surge of panic. There has to be a way out, he said, his voice rising. There has to be. The old man's expression softened, and for the first time, Rick saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. There is one way, the old man said. But it's dangerous. Rick leaned forward, desperate. What is it? Tell me. The old man hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. You have to confront the house, he said. Face your fear head on. If you can do that, the house might let you go. Rick's mind reeled. Confront the house? How? The old man stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked over to the window and looked out at the darkened road. There's something in this house, something dark, something evil, he said. It's what feeds on our fear. You have to find it, confront it, and destroy it. Rick felt a surge of determination. He didn't know if he believed the old man, but he had to try. He couldn't stay in this house forever. What do I need to do? Rick asked, his voice steady. The old man turned to face him, his expression grave. You need to go down to the basement, he said. That's where it lives. Rick's heart skipped a beat. The basement. He had seen the door earlier, but he had avoided it, sensing that something terrible lay beyond it. But now he had no choice. If he wanted to escape, he had to face whatever was down there. Rick stood up, his hands trembling. He took a deep breath and made his way to the basement door. The old man followed him, his presence a silent reassurance. The door creaked as Rick pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. The air was colder here, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Rick descended the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. Each step felt like a step closer to his doom, but he forced himself to keep going. The basement was pitch black, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were damp, covered in a thick layer of mold. The air was thick with a sense of dread, as if the very walls were closing in on him. Rick took a deep breath and stepped into the basement. The old man stayed at the top of the stairs, watching him with a solemn expression. Rick's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of the evil presence the old man had spoken of. But the basement was empty, save for a few old, rotting crates and a rusted furnace in the corner. He moved deeper into the basement, his nerves on edge. The flickering light cast eerie shadows on the walls, making it seem as if the darkness itself was alive, shifting and writhing around him. And then he heard a low, rumbling growl that made his blood run cold. Rick froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The growl grew louder, more menacing, echoing through the basement like the roar of some ancient beast. Rick turned, his eyes wide with fear, and saw it. A shape emerged from the darkness, a hulking, twisted figure that seemed to be made of shadow and malice. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth. The air around it crackled with a dark energy, as if the very essence of evil had taken form. Rick's breath caught in his throat as the creature moved toward him, its growl vibrating through the air like a death knell. He wanted to run, to flee back up the stairs and never look back, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The creature's eyes locked onto Rick's, and he felt a wave of pure terror wash over him. It was as if the creature was reaching into his very soul, feeding on his fear, growing stronger with every moment that passed. But then something shifted within Rick. The old man's words echoed in his mind. You have to confront the house, face your fear head on. He knew what he had to do. He had to fight back with a surge of adrenaline. Rick reached for the closest thing he could find, a rusted metal pipe lying on the floor. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles white, and took a step forward. The creature snarled, its eyes narrowing as it sensed Rick's newfound resolve. But Rick didn't hesitate. With a roar of defiance, he swung the pipe at the creature, striking it with all the strength he could muster. The creature let out a howl of rage and pain, recoiling from the blow. Rick didn't stop. He swung the pipe again and again, each strike fueled by his fear, his anger, his desperation. The creature fought back, its claws slashing through the air, narrowly missing Rick as he ducked and dodged. The basement was filled with the sounds of their struggle, the clang of metal against flesh, the growls of the creature, the grunts of effort from Rick. Finally, with one last, powerful swing, Rick struck the creature in the head. There was a sickening crunch, and the creature let out a final, ear-piercing scream before collapsing to the floor in a heap of shadow and darkness. Rick stood there, panting, his chest heaving with exertion. The pipe fell from his hands, clattering to the floor as he stared down at the creature's lifeless form. The basement was silent once more, the air still and heavy. But Rick could feel the change in the atmosphere, a lightening, a release of the oppressive energy that had filled the house. He had done it. He had confronted the darkness and won. Slowly, Rick made his way back up the stairs, his legs weak and trembling. The old man was waiting for him at the top, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. You did it, the old man said, his voice soft. You broke the curse. Rick nodded, too exhausted to speak. He followed the old man back to the front door, the weight of what he had just experienced settling in ... As they reached the door, the old man turned to Rick, a sad smile on his face. Thank you, he said. You've set us free. Rick frowned, confused. Us? But before the old man could answer, he began to fade, his form growing transparent, then vanishing altogether. Rick blinked, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just seen. The house around him began to shift, the walls crumbling, the floor buckling beneath his feet. Rick ran out the front door just as the house collapsed in on itself, disappearing into the ground as if it had never existed. Rick stood there, panting, staring at the spot where the house had been. The trees around him were still, the air clear and fresh. It was over. The nightmare was over. Rick didn't waste any time getting back to his van. He started the engine and drove away, not daring to look back. He didn't know what he would tell Dave, didn't know how he would explain what had happened. But one thing was certain. He was never coming back to Craven Road. As Rick drove down the winding road, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, there was nothing there, just the empty road stretching out behind him. Rick took a deep breath and focused on the road ahead. The past was behind him, and he was determined to leave it there. But in the back of his mind, Rick knew that some things could never be truly left behind. The memory of the house, of the old man, of the creature in the basement, those memories would stay with him, haunting him in the quiet moments, in the dark corners of his mind. And as Rick drove into the distance, he couldn't help but wonder, had he really escaped? Or had he merely traded one nightmare for another? Story 3. The Domino's Delivery. It was late October, and Luke was just another college student scraping by. His days were filled with lectures, assignments, and the constant stress of upcoming exams. His nights, however, were spent working as a delivery driver for Domino's Pizza. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and the tips were usually decent. Most nights, Luke could zone out as he drove around town, delivering pizza to customers. But one night, a night he would come to regret, he was given a delivery that would haunt him forever. It was a chilly Friday evening. The sky was a dark, foreboding gray, and the air carried the scent of rain. Luke was nearing the end of his shift, ready to clock out and head home when the last order of the night came in. 4 large pizzas, 2 bottles of soda, and an address he didn't recognize, a house on the outskirts of town. Luke groaned inwardly as he read the order slip. The location was way out of the way, in a part of town he wasn't familiar with. But a job was a job, and he was determined to finish his shift without complaint. He loaded the pizzas into his car, punched the address into his GPS, and set off. The streets were mostly empty as he drove, the occasional streetlight casting pools of yellow light onto the pavement. The further he got from the center of town, the fewer lights there were. Soon, he was driving down dark, winding roads, the trees on either side looming like silent sentinels. As he followed the GPS's directions, the houses became fewer and farther between until there were none at all. The road narrowed, twisting and turning through dense woods. Luke couldn't shake the feeling that he was heading into the middle of nowhere. The GPS announced that he was approaching his destination, and sure enough, as he rounded a bend, he saw it. The house stood at the end of a long gravel driveway, its dark silhouette barely visible against the overcast sky. It was old, very old, its wooden walls weathered and gray. The windows were dark, and the front porch sagged under the weight of years of neglect. There was no car in the driveway, no lights on inside. It looked abandoned. Luke's stomach twisted with unease, but he pushed the feeling aside. Maybe the owners were just reclusive or hadn't gotten around to fixing up the place. He parked the car and grabbed the pizzas, balancing them carefully as he made his way up the driveway. The wind rustled the leaves, and the trees creaked in the cold night air. Luke hesitated at the bottom of the porch steps, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. Something about the house felt wrong. But he shook off the feeling and forced himself to climb the steps. The wood creaked under his weight, and the front door loomed before him, dark and ominous. He knocked, the sound echoing through the quiet night. There was no answer. Luke knocked again, louder this time, and waited. After what felt like an eternity, the door slowly creaked open, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. A pair of eyes peered out at him from the shadows, and Luke had to resist the urge to take a step back. Domino's delivery, he said, holding up the pizzas. 4 large pizzas and 2 bottles of soda. The eyes blinked, and then the door opened wider, revealing the figure of an old man. He was gaunt, with pale skin stretched tight over his bones and thin, wispy hair. His eyes were sunken, and there was something unsettling about the way he looked at Luke, as if he were seeing right through him. The old man didn't speak. He simply stepped aside and gestured for Luke to come in. Luke hesitated. It was against company policy to enter a customer's home, especially at night. But the old man didn't seem threatening, just odd. And Luke didn't want to be rude. With a slight nod, he stepped inside. The air inside the house was cold, colder than it should have been, and carried a musty, damp smell. The entryway was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, and the walls were bare, the wallpaper peeling in places. The floorboards creaked under Luke's feet as he walked, and his breath misted in the chilly air. Where should I put the pizzas? Luke asked, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. The old man didn't answer. He just pointed to a doorway that led into what appeared to be the kitchen. Luke nodded and made his way through the narrow hallway. The kitchen was as barren as the rest of the house, no furniture, no appliances, just empty counters and a single, bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Luke set the pizzas down on the counter and turned back to the old man, who was standing in the doorway, watching him with those unsettling eyes. That'll be 38.50, Luke said, trying to keep his voice steady. The old man nodded slowly and reached into the pocket of his tattered coat. He pulled out a crumpled wad of cash and handed it to Luke. As Luke took the money, his fingers brushed against the old man's hand, and he nearly recoiled. The man's skin was ice cold, and his touch sent a shiver down Luke's spine. Thanks, Luke mumbled, stuffing the money into his pocket. He turned to leave, but the old man's voice stopped him. Stay for a while, the old man said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. It's not safe to leave just yet. Luke froze, his heart skipping a beat. I have other deliveries to make, he stammered, inching toward the door. I really need to get going. The old man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Luke thought he saw a flicker of something dark and malevolent behind them. They're out there, the old man whispered, his voice trembling. Waiting. Watching, Luke's pulse quickened. He didn't know what the old man was talking about, didn't want to know. All he wanted was to get out of that house and away from whatever strange game the old man was playing. I really should go, Luke said, forcing a smile. He turned and made a beeline for the front door, his footsteps echoing through the empty house. But as he reached the door, he heard a soft, shuffling sound coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Luke paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound grew louder, closer, as if something or someone was moving toward him. Luke's breath caught in his throat, and he slowly turned around, his eyes scanning the dark hallway. There was nothing there. But the shuffling continued, coming from just around the corner, in the direction of the basement. Luke's mind raced, his body frozen in place. He knew he should leave, but something kept him rooted to the spot, a morbid curiosity mingling with his fear. And then he saw it, a shadowy figure emerging from the darkness, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps. The figure was tall and thin, its limbs long and gangly, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. As it stepped into the dim light, Luke's breath hitched in his throat. It was another man, but this one was even more grotesque than the old man who had opened the door. His skin was pallid and covered in sores, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He wore tattered, filthy clothes, and his hair hung in greasy, matted strands over his face. The man's eyes locked onto Luke, and a twisted smile spread across his cracked lips. You shouldn't have come here, he rasped, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. You'll never leave. Luke's heart pounded in his chest, and his mind screamed at him to run. But his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. His body refusing to obey, the man took another step closer, and the smell hit Luke, an overpowering stench of decay and rot that made his stomach turn. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the very walls of the house were closing in on him. Luke finally found his voice, a strangled cry escaping his lips as he stumbled back, his hands fumbling for the doorknob. He had to get out now, but before he could turn the knob, The door to the basement slammed open with a deafening bang, and another figure burst out, lunging toward Luke with a speed that took his breath away. This one was even worse, a woman, or what had once been a woman, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of hatred. Her eyes were wild, her mouth twisted into a snarl, her fingers clawed in reaching for him. Luke screamed, adrenaline surging through his veins as he yanked the door open and bolted outside. He didn't stop to look back, didn't care about the pizzas or the money. All he cared about was getting as far away from that house as possible. The cold night air hit him like a slap in the face as he sprinted to his car, his heart pounding in his ears. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the door unlocked. Finally, he managed to get the door open and threw himself inside, slamming it shut behind him. He jammed the key into the ignition and twisted it, the engine roaring to life. Without a second thought, Luke floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as the car sped down the gravel driveway and onto the dark, winding road. But even as he drove, his heart still racing, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The road stretched on before him, the trees closing in on either side like a tunnel. The headlights cut through the darkness, but there was no sign of the town, no sign of the safety he had been so desperate to reach. Luke's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those grotesque figures chasing after him. But the road behind him was empty, the house already lost to the shadows. He tried to calm his racing heart, tried to focus on the road, but the fear gnawed at him, a cold, relentless presence in the back of his mind. The farther he drove, the more lost he felt, as if the road was leading him deeper and deeper into the woods, away from any hope of escape. Finally, after what felt like hours, Luke saw something up ahead, a shape in the middle of the road, illuminated by the car's headlights. His heart leaped into his throat as he slowed the car, his eyes straining to make out what it was. It was a figure, tall, thin, and unmoving, standing in the middle of the road, blocking his path. As Luke drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was the old man. Luke's blood ran cold as the old man raised a hand and pointed directly at him, his eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. The same twisted smile spread across his lips, and Luke felt a wave of terror wash over him. Without thinking, Luke slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just a few feet from the old man. He sat there, frozen with fear, his mind racing. And then the old man began to move, his steps slow and deliberate as he approached the car. Luke's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he watched the old man draw closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Get away," Luke whispered, his voice trembling. "Get away from me." But the old man didn't stop. He kept walking, his eyes locked onto Luke's, his smile widening. Luke's hands fumbled for the gear shift, his mind screaming at him to drive, to get away. But as he tried to shift into reverse, the car's engine sputtered and died, the headlights flickering before plunging him into darkness. "No, no, no," Luke muttered, his hands trembling as he tried to restart the engine. But it was no use. The car was dead. Panic surged through him as he looked back up, only to find the old man standing right next to the driver's side window, his face inches from the glass. "Stay with us," the old man whispered, his breath fogging up the window. "Stay forever," Luke screamed, pushing himself away from the window, his back pressing against the passenger seat. The old man's eyes glowed in the darkness, his smile twisted into something almost inhuman. And then, from the corner of his eye, Luke saw movement, shadows shifting in the darkness, more figures emerging from the trees, their eyes glowing with the same sickly light. They were all around him now, surrounding the car, their faces twisted and grotesque. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. Luke's mind raced, his body paralyzed with fear. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to escape. All he knew was that he was trapped, surrounded by these things, whatever they were, and then, as the darkness closed in, he heard it a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down his spine. The figures began to close in, their eyes locked onto Luke, their movements slow and deliberate. Luke's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he tried to think of a way out. But there was none. He was trapped, surrounded by these creatures, their eyes glowing in the darkness. And then, just as the first figure reached the car, the world went black. When Luke awoke, he was sitting in his car, the morning sun shining through the windows. The road was empty, the trees still, as if the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a nightmare. But as he looked around, his heart still pounding, he knew it hadn't been a dream. The fear, the terror, was still fresh in his mind, and the memory of those glowing eyes, those twisted smiles, haunted him. With shaking hands, Luke started the car and drove away, determined to put as much distance between himself and that place as possible. But no matter how far he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that those creatures were still out there, waiting for him. And as the miles stretched on, Luke couldn't help but wonder if he had really escaped, or if he was still trapped in their grasp, doomed to relive that nightmare again and again. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.